Hello and welcome to the Shropshire Witches Podcast. It is our second episode where we are going to talk about all things death.
Yes.
It's very exciting.
I'm very excited about this. I am, as I know you are as well. And for anyone who can see this, we have got a wonderful little ghost that Amy gave me as a belated birthday present. I love it. And he's here with his eyes glowing. So it's a very appropriate prop to have. So all things death, we're going to cover what ghosts, death omens,
superstitions,
love that.
Corpse roads. Got the queen of the corpse roads right here.
Thank you very much. I know of all the things we queen of, but love that. Fabulous. So if we were going to look at death, how are we going to start this? What would be your...
So I think it's interesting to look at it in the folkloric context because death happens to us all, not to be morbid.
No, it's inevitable.
It's inevitable
thing of life. Yeah.
And that has been knowledge that has been weaved through our history and our culture and our kind of traditions since probably before records even began, but certainly in the folkloric context there is a really strong presence of death omens, particular rules in which you look after and the dead and funerary customs that underpin our understanding of what it means to die.
Okay.
And a lot of my research, well, I say a lot, most of my research is in the Shropshire context, but within the Shropshire context there is a strong presence of death folklore that covers from when somebody is dying all the way through to the day of their funeral.
Yeah.
And it's quite a rich body of folklore, which I think could be mistaken as superstitious. I think in our world today, our kind of postmodernist kind of world, we see superstition as something that negates to being inferior or stupid or not ignorance. And I think that simply is wrong. And I think if there's one thing we can show through this podcast and through this episode is that superstition does not mean ignorance. Superstition is a means in which you can govern and understand the intangible. And I think that is certainly the case in Shropshire, is that these beliefs were there to help aid someone through their grief. And I think we're going to look at that in a little bit of detail as the episode goes on. But I think it's worth starting with kind of some of our ideas about what it means to help someone to die and how you can make sure that your loved one has a good death. And a lot of the folklore that we'll be looking at today from the Shropshire side of things comes from the 1800s, the Victorians, who were, as we probably anyone that's a bit like us know, they were obsessed with death because death was such a prominent feature of their world. So within Shropshire, there is the idea that you must help someone to die, and there's certain ways in which they can die, and it actually means that they will go to heaven or go to wherever they're meant to be, and also to prevent a ghost. And I think another thing that we're going to look at is how so much of this folklore is linked to preventing a ghost, which could be linked again to a prevalence of belief in ghosts, but also that idea that it's better to prevent it, even if you're not sure whether there's such a thing as ghosts. It's better to prevent than it is to allow that to happen.
That's really interesting. And I think it's, I suppose it also covers that shift of belief in ghosts, which has perhaps historically, when you're kind of in a more non-secular time, you're looking at this idea of a ghost being generally a bad thing because your soul, particularly in a Catholic sense, I suppose. And I know this alters kind of post Reformation, the idea of what a ghost is changes in its essence, doesn't it? But this sort of belief in ghosts now as a modern thing is something to kind of be either scared or kind of enticed by. I know historically they always still loved a ghost story, but it was more of a preventative thing.
Yes,
because it was tangible to them. Was I think because death is kind of slightly apart from just some of the abysmal things that go on in the world. I think as we're speaking from the UK generally, we're extremely privileged in terms of not being exposed in the way that we live. So we don't see, or apart from obviously COVID, but in a way we're not kind of exposed to plagues and things that they would have been. And so death is slightly more sanitized for us and is something we grieve, but is separate. We don't generally have open coffins and things. As a general rule, we don't tend to keep our loved ones in the house in the way that we did. So the idea of ghosts now, almost for us, it seems an odd thing to think of a ghost that could be any more recent than 19th century.
Yeah.
It's changed, doesn't it? What we think of as ghosts. Ghosts are now a story, is something we tell, or something you either poo-poo or you think, oh, that's a bit eerie. It's not something we kind of try to prevent happening. I think we wear ghost stories on our sleeve. We're worried about being laughed at, but actually most of us in some way, even if we don't believe in them, love a ghost story.
Yeah. No,
there is nothing that prevails through time like a ghost story.
Yeah. And I think I like the idea of you saying that we wear them on our sleeve, but there's an element of fear about being laughed at. I think ghosts now, and I think we've had such a kind of cultural rebirth of the ghost through things like Uncanny and the work that Danny Robbins is doing. Shout out to Danny Robbins. I think it's become a lot more acceptable to say you believe in ghosts, or that you believe in there's the possibility of ghosts, but they have become a lot more sanitized. They have become less of a threat and more something that we either experience passively for a split second, or, we have a haunting. Whereas in the context of the time we're looking at, in kind of that 1800s, it was very much at least it was reported as very much a fear that if you didn't have a good death, that you could be haunted by your loved one, and that they would be denied that afterlife that they deserved. And this starts right the way, even before the act of death is upon us. So all the way, before death is actually a thing. So there's a lot of death omens in Shropshire that are seemingly quite innocuous things. For example, a number of animals take on the mantle of death omens. Ones that you wouldn't even necessarily expect. So there is a number of references in Shropshire to dogs barking in the night. If a dog is barking in the night, that is a sign that death is coming to the house. And then we have things that are a little bit more obvious due to their kind of other symbolism, like owls. There's owls that are death omens in Shropshire. That particularly if owls fly against the window or some way fly around the house, they're seen as a death omen. And I think that's in part due to culturally, owls are seen as a intermissary between worlds. They're meant to be able to, in some bodies of mythology, travel between our world and the spirit world. So understandably then they'd be able to tell us who was due to die. And there's a number of references in Shropshire to people, quite pragmatic people, saying that the owls know. And it's always that phrase is them owls know. Them owls know that someone is due to die. Even things like pigeons, you would never look at a pigeon and think death omen.
They don't even seem synonymous with Shropshire, do they?
No. They don't even look like they know what's going on half the time. But supposedly in Shropshire, pigeons are a death omen, and it's quite a recent kind of death will come quite quickly. Even things like bees, and we'll mention bees in a little bit later, due to the telling the bees, its prevalence in Shropshire. Bees are a death omen, so if a single bee or wasp flies into your house, then that's a sign that within 7 days someone will die. So we have these signs even before the death is physically upon us that can tell us when that death will happen. And I think that in a way is, again, and we mentioned it in the previous episode, and a way in which we're trying to structure and control the uncontrollable. We can't choose when someone dies. We can't unless we kill them, which is not nice.
I love the bombshell. Unless we kill them.
Don't kill people.
Generally, it's regarded as a bad.
Yes, moral and criminal sin. But we can't control death. But through these stories and these beliefs and these cultural things, we are able to try and govern it and and that's where you get things coming in after the death omens of things like, supposedly in Shropshire, you can't die on a feather pillow, which is a bit bizarre, particularly if it's got like peacock or more kind of like game bird feathers in it.
Who's got a peacock feather?
Apparently in the past it would be just you'd get whatever feathers you can get.
I suppose if you peacocks, or
pheasants as well, and any bird feather really. You can't die on a feather pillow. So there would be instances which seem quite cruel to us of people who were in the deathbed being either lowered off the bed to die on the floor, or had the pillow removed so they're on the bed to stop them prolonging their life, prolonging their suffering, and actually being brought to the moment of death. And there's one quite famous one that Charlotte Byrne mentions of a woman whose husband the bed was made out of feathers, and I mean it was stuffed with feathers. It wasn't just a big pile of feathers.
Like
she wasn't a bird.
Feathers. Yeah. It was a nest.
The mattress was a feather mattress, and the pillow was a feather pillow. So she lowered her husband onto the floor to help him to die. And there was very much a belief that there were certain things you must follow to help that person cross over. And then if we move on to kind of when that person has died, there's certain things you must do in order to ensure that their spirit physically moves on, which links again to the idea of death omens be a preventative measure to stop the ghost. So, for example, it's quite a common one. You open every window and every door to allow the spirit to leave.
Yeah.
And I used to work in care, and I worked with nurses who would still do that in the 2000s. They would, as soon as someone had passed over, they would open the windows to allow the spirit to leave. So it's quite a common thing. Another one is because traditionally, as you mentioned, people tended to stay in the home until the moment of their funeral. So they would rearrange the furniture in their bedroom. So if traditionally people would die in their own bedroom, they would take the body out, pop it downstairs in the living room so people could visit. And also then you would go upstairs and rearrange everything to ensure that if the spirit managed to make the journey back to the house, it would go to its bedroom and it wouldn't know where it was. It wouldn't recognise it. So thus it would be able to move on.
It's extraordinary.
It's really interesting. And even things like there was a belief that because death was a lot more open and accepted and visual in the Victorian period, is on the process of when you come to visit the dead relative or dead neighbour, you must put your hand on the dead person.
Okay.
Because if you visited them and you didn't touch them, they would be able to haunt your dreams. So by touching the corpse, you were able to then prevent that personal haunting in your dreams. So it's a really fascinating subject in general. But in Shropshire, we do seem to have a real body of folklore associated with this thing.
I think that's really interesting. And I wonder if, I suppose, in some respects, when you look at things like the Victorians, and I mean, look, you can't talk about death and not talk about the Victorians, but the memento moris and this idea of kind of, when somebody dies, like keeping elements of like whether it be their hair, and you have pictures that are woven from hair and things like that. They're extraordinary, and you can have photographs, and that's a very famous thing, isn't it? It's having photographs of the dead. And because obviously, like you get this idea of Victorian photographs that they didn't smile because they were miserable. It's not. It's because obviously the delay in taking the photograph. It was easier to just sit kind of in a sedentary pose, but. This idea of death being so prolific, so tangible, I think what is interesting as well is the idea of just how prolific these death omens are, is the thought that maybe through the peace reaper of time we forget that death was as raw to them as it is today. So, in terms of, the infant death rate was extremely high, women dying during childbirth, things like this, after childbirth, because of perhaps lack of sanitation or awareness and things like this, it didn't mean that people didn't grieve as intensely. It was just exhibited in a different way. And I think this idea of the set grieving time, and it's all very interesting, and mourning clothes, and this idea really of death omens, because to them, if you absolutely believed in God in whatever capacity, you absolutely thought there was a soul to protect.
Yes.
You know, so this idea of forgiveness, this idea of a ghost. So even kind of mentioning earlier than probably planning the episode is something, again, like Christmas Carol is kind of the pinnacle of a ghost story. I mean, I know you've got like Henry James and the Telling of the Screw, all this kind of thing, but this idea of Jacob Marley, if you're thinking of a ghost that's in the vernacular, to us, it's a very spooky, eerie, bit of an omen thing, but also to the Victorians, it would have been incredibly obvious why he was a ghost. Yeah. Was because he'd sinned. Because that is why his soul cannot rest, which it is relevant to a modern audience as well, but perhaps it's layered in terms of how we probably find it spookier because there's a ghost and all this kind of idea of him haunting and coming up the stairs. And maybe to the Victorians, maybe I'm wrong, but it might have been more of a double warning than it is to us, because if I wanted to, because I wrote it down so I can get the wording exactly right, but I just thought... This is the kind of the iconic bits here. So I wear the chain I forged in life. I made it link by link and yard by yard. I guarded it on my own free will, and by my own free will, I wore it. And then, of course, the best line, which must be, and I think, and we've discussed this just before this episode, actually, that I think this must be Dickens at his finest. You may be an undigested bit of beef, a blot of mustard, a crumb of cheese, a fragment of underdone potato. There's more of gravy than of grave about you, whatever you are.
It's amazing.
It's fabulous, isn't it? So I think there's a slight kind of nonchalance from Scrooge there, but this idea of like the phantom haunting and that he was delivering a message is not something like it's we immediately think of Dickens, but there are much older ghost stories. So The Three Living, the Three Dead, this very famous painting picture image from medieval England, which was this idea of these three young men going hunting, and they meet three spirits in essence, and they say, as thou art, so once I was. And it's a warning of basically how to live well so you don't end up as a ghost.
Yeah.
So it's interesting. And so through the centuries, this idea of like Jacob Marley was seen as creepy and is still iconic to us, but this is a centuries old trope, isn't it?
Massively,
of a warning to people.
Yeah. And I think it's the idea that particularly within folkloric hauntings, you do have other tropes, but most people haunt an area because there is something that either has not been done to honour them, and that's what we see with some of the Shropshire-based stuff, or they have unfinished business,
that's the old adage,
or that they have sinned and they are afraid of what comes next. And you see evidence of all the different types within Shropshire, and you also see with a lot of ghosts, in particularly female ghosts in Shropshire, that they are a residue of an incredibly traumatic event that happened to a working class woman. And I think that a lot of, at least the female spirits within Shropshire, are representative of a community's collectivised kind of loss and trauma based on something that has been terribly enacted towards a woman. And we see that with traditional ghost stories such as Madam Piggott. We see that with Mary Way and her being essentially brutalised by a group of men and left for dead on a road in the middle of the countryside. And her spirit still haunts the lanes and the roads that are around that area, not necessarily because there is still a belief in ghosts or, her spirit transcends the idea of the ghost. It's there because the community has never realised and dealt with what actually happened to her. She couldn't continue. Her life was taken from her, but her spirit could. And I think so many ghost stories in at least in Shropshire are a way in which that a community deals with what happens afterwards.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
And particularly when it comes to women, I think there are evidence of other types. Particularly, there is a number of different ones where there is a spirit that has stayed around because something hasn't been done right. There's a brilliant one in Oswestry to do with cleaning, and a lady goes and stops at this big old house in Oswestry, and she hears cleaning late into the night.
Okay,
and she asks if it was the maids when she wakes up the next morning, and the lady's like, "Oh no, that's the ghosts," because the house it's been haunted by there's various versions, but it's been haunted by the old housekeeper, and the house isn't being looked after quite the way she would want it. So she's improving it. But there's lots of different ghosts within Shropshire, but there is definitely a link to trauma, and that can be traumatic death, that can be the trauma of the loss of that person, and I think that's why I think these superstitions aren't something that we should look down on. We shouldn't look down on people in the past because they are a way in which those people are trying to conceptualise their grief. And it's quite interesting, in Shropshire there is a number of references to how to deal with grief. So there was a belief, and I love Charlotte Byrne. I will preface this. Charlotte Byrne is one of the reasons I do what I do, but she's also very judgmental about certain groups of people, including including people from tends to be more working class mining communities, pretty much where I'm from. So she states that there is a belief among these ignorant mining communities that when a person dies, their spirit stays in the world for 40 days afterwards, and that is when the people that were closest to them, so their close family, won't feel like they're actually gone, that they're with them and they continue to feel like they're around. And that can even be like physically feel like touch and smells, and which really links to some of our ghost lore that is a little bit later. But that spirit for 40 days is not gone. They're with their closest family and even friends. But then after that 40 days, they leave and they go to wherever they should be. Unless there is something that prevents them from going, like they've not been buried properly, or they've not been particularly honoured in a particular way. But also after that 40 days, there is a belief that you shouldn't excessively mourn. And I think there's a danger of seeing that as Victorian stiff upper lip or prudishness without actually looking at it in its cultural context. A lot of these beliefs come from working class communities that are living on the absolute knife edge of poverty.
Yeah, exactly right. Yeah.
If you allowed that feeling to overwhelm you and you allowed yourself to grieve excessively, that's not going to put bread on the table. That's not going to continue to keep you
have
out
to be
of
practical to a degree. Pragmatic.
Yeah. So I think it's not actually a cruel thing. It's not out of a lack of care, because as we know, people profoundly cared about their relatives, and just like we do now, it was a way in which you tried to carry on.
Necessity has to facilitate normal life in a way as much as possible. I mean, do you think, I'm interested as well because, I'm South Shropshire, which was a big lead mining community, as my family were miners and quite a lot of them were Welsh miners. There's a real Baptist influence in the mining community. And I think maybe something like the 40 days, is that a biblical thing? Because to them, Charlotte Byrne looking down at Mivy's coming from a position of privilege, which is the same as when people were kind of mimicking what they thought was a romanticised idea of working life. So you had this with the kind of the Bloomsbury set and all that. It's nothing new. But surely this 40 days is as to what is reasonable for a mourning period in terms of having to earn some money as well. But equally, surely those threads of biblical relevance and biblical dates and time restraints and things must have been relevant, because a lot of miners had that Baptist or Methodist vein, didn't they? Do you think that's right, or is that jump into conclusions?
I think you could certainly argue that. I definitely think that
maybe it depends where you are. South Shropshire maybe, or and
I think as well you would naturally be influenced by the things you were hearing at church. So even if you weren't particularly devout or that kind of thing, these religion as a cultural thing, you would pick up on those things and you would be influenced by it. So it's entirely reasonable to presume that actually they'd heard that date being used.
40 days is a familiar concept.
So that's why it's 40 days. And I certainly think that within communities that maybe are miners, you see a lot within the Victorian period in the East Shropshire coalfield and the lead mining communities of this folklore that is linked to death. So up in the Stiperstones area, the litchfowl is a bird that you hear, and if you hear it of a night time, it is a sign that someone in your home is going to die. A lot of miners would not do certain things when they're actually down within the mines, because that is the idea that if you don't follow certain rules, you will be claimed. And also things I've found, there's a concept called the knocks of death, and that seems to have more prominence in areas like the Shropshire coalfield and the lead mines. And that's the idea that of a night time you hear 3 knocks on your door or on the walls, and that's a sign that someone will die. And we have evidence folkloric evidence of miners refusing to go down the mines after hearing the knocks of death, assuming that there is going to be them that will die. There's a wonderful, it's a very sad story, but there's a wonderful story that comes from South Shropshire of a man having quite a prophetic dream and believing that in this dream that there was a sign that somebody was going to die. And he tells his wife probably over breakfast that he's had this dream, and his wife becomes very terrified for him. And she says, no, you can't go to work. I'm not letting you can't go. And he poo-poos it a little bit and goes, oh, it's just a dream, goes to work, and he never comes back. So it's a very real thing for these people. And even if there's nothing to it, and it is a superstition, it was the axis of their world. It was the way in which they formulated their ideas. And I think we need to have respect for that.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think it's I suppose it's like we've said, it's coping with something that was part of day-to-day life, but also felt preternatural in a way as well, because death is inevitable and it is a natural part of life, but it is something that people have historically and probably always will feared because the life-shattering effects of it in terms of those that are left behind. I think it's really, really fascinating. And I suppose in terms of death omens and superstitions, we could probably lead to something like corpse road. Should we do corpse roads?
Yes.
I love a corpse road. So these are roads. What I find interesting about this actually in corpse roads and paths and whichever else, a bit like fairy roads, it's a different thing, but they sort of litter the landscape and would have done once more prolifically. But equally, they are often mistaken for sheep paths and are the predecessor to a lot of footpaths as well, which is really interesting. So we're looking at this idea, which will coincide and coexist with your death omens, which are people living predominantly in rural communities, which really for a long time they were, right up to sort of by the, I know, these dates can be a little bit inaccurate, but 18th, 19th century, there were still large communities with predominantly living, especially pre kind of industrial revolution in rural communities, and roads were not roads. I mean, I say roads if you think of them today, but it's like pothole galore, especially if you get to South Shropshire, you're just taking your tyre off. But there you go. But these were roads, paths that went from people's houses across the countryside to a church, to the nearest church, chapel, depending on your disposition. But they, as much as possible, tried to follow a straight line in terms of being navigable, but they had to do things like cross a body of water. They would leave feet first, which I know you'll talk about as well, so the ghosts couldn't find their way back to the house that they had come from. But also, wasn't there something that some of the shape had to not be ghost-like travelling in straight lines, don't they? So it had to be navigable, but they had to also have a route that then would become quite difficult for the ghost to meander their way back. Is this right? And they led eventually then to the church or the chapel. We'll say chapel because I come from a Baptist family, so we'll say chapel. And they had a lich gate, which is the sort of for those that don't know, is that sort of almost like a porch, isn't it? It's like a wooden porch outside a church. Either sometimes affixed to the church, but mostly it's at the entrance, and then there's a path up. And there's lots of good examples. There's a nice one at St Michael's in Bishop's Castle. And actually, I just as an aside, I learned recently, I think this is right, that St Michael's, they're usually called a St Michael in an area where they've had a problem with witchcraft and things. Is that right? And
I've heard that as well,
I think that's really interesting. So that was like just an aside that I thought was really interesting. So what would happen is they'd then put this body, and this is the practical and the superstitious being bedfellows again, but they would put the coffin under the lich gate, because often if you're making a journey like that, it wasn't the day of the funeral, this procession, and there'd be quite a few people involved in this as well. It wasn't like just you and me lugging a coffin across South Shropshire, although it's quite an image. They leave them under this gate, and of course for the weather aspect, equally someone would stay with them for the security aspect as well. But one belief, and I'm sure you know this already, was that the ghost of the last person buried was overseeing the churchyard, would wait for the next person. So once that person had come in, that person was sort of liberated, and the next person coming in would stand watch until the next person died. Well, now you might have quite a wait, but in those days, obviously the wait was probably shorter. Yeah,
and that's a very prominent belief within Shropshire, and also the idea that the first soul to be buried in the church belonged to the devil.
Oh, I see. I didn't know that. That's interesting.
That's a very prominent in Shropshire, and that became particularly a problem within Telford, pre-Telford. So the area that we are just talking about is Telford. That's a very 1960s.
Yes,
it was. But the area has a very long history. Some of them, like Dorley and places like that, actually have a doomsday communities.
Oh, okay.
So they're very, very old villages with a lot of history and culture and folkloric traditions, which is now part of what we would call Telford.
Yeah.
And when Telford was really, it was at the centre of the birthplace of industry and the Industrial Revolution through places like Coalbrookdale. There was a real growth in the area during the Victorian period, where people were moving for work, for an opportunity to be part of, the industry of the area. So therefore, you had a growth in population, you had a growth in cemeteries. But then you had this idea that the first soul to be buried in the cemetery belonged to the devil. So you have a lot of anecdotal folkloric stories of families who've moved to the area that might have moved from other parts of Shropshire or over the border that don't want their relative to be buried in the nude graveyard.
Understandable.
Because they don't want their soul to belong to the devil. So they will actually kick up a bit of a fuss and try and get them to be buried somewhere else, because they don't want that. And you hear all sorts of ways in which they tried to get around it by, you know, when like a dog had died, burying the dog in the churchyard.
And the dog.
Yeah. So it was quite a prominent belief, but certainly there is an idea in Shropshire of the first soul, the last soul to be buried in the churchyard is the one that is the guardian of the churchyard. And we have really some amazing examples of quite fierce guardians.
Okay.
So there's a ghost that is meant to haunt St Lawrence's Church in Ludlow, and she's described as being inhumanly tall, which for a start is terrifying. And she is not a very old woman.
Tall, I love it. Yeah.
And she is said to run round the gravestone screaming at the top of her voice.
So she's agile.
So she's very agile and she's very annoyed, which
is like
not something you could describe myself as. But she, in a way, could be other reasons for her haunting, but she is a graveyard guardian. She is preventing, in a very visceral way, she's preventing anyone from harming her patch.
Well, because you're not going to fuck with her, are you?
No, if I saw her, I would run the other way and never come back.
Tall, like screeching, high energy, old. I'd be like, no, mate, not worth it. Like, pick your battles.
Yeah, and then there's another example within another St Michael's in Madeley, which actually did have a problem with witches because there was one witch that was so small she could sit on a cuckoo, and she said to have caused all sorts of bother.
Love that. Yeah.
Absolute amazing. And then they tried to capture her, and then she just called her cuckoo and flew off, laughing as she goes.
How feisty are you if you can sit on a cuckoo? Because like, that's like sitting on a magpie. I'm like, mate, I mean, they're tiny, but also like they are not biddable birds.
No,
so, like,
no.
You know, you're not kind of befriending a wren or something. It's a bit of a chill.
So she's amazing. And St Michael's Church is meant to be haunted by a more gentle graveyard guardian. And again, she's an old woman, which is interesting because you've got this link to kind of like the matriarch archetypes and stuff like that. And she's meant to walk from stone to stone and go to some of the more neglected looking stones. And some of them, people that have witnessed her have even suggested that they've seen her put flowers down. And there's the most kind of vivid description of her comes from the 1970s. And it was a man walking to work through the graveyard, and he sees this woman, says hello to her and sees her put flowers down, and then she disappears and there's no flowers there. Yeah. So we've got these graveyard guardians that seem to transcend the last person to be buried, because it could very well be that they are just the last people to be buried in that area, or they've took on the mantle of the guardian. And I think it's particularly interesting as well at St Michael's Church. There's a belief that a funeral shouldn't follow the same path as a wedding. And it's again, it links to the corpse roads, because you wouldn't take a bride up over the hills and round the corner and up round. You take the most direct route.
Come on, love, off you go.
Count up. So at St Michael's Church, there's actually 2 entrances. So folklore states how true it is, we don't know, as with everything with folklore, but folklore states it's 1 entrance for a wedding and 1 entrance for a funeral. And it kind of makes like a wishbone kind of shape. So it could very well be that that's just a design that they've chosen when they built the church, and it's nothing to do with the folklore, and the folklore kind of was born afterwards. But it could very well be that the folklore actually influenced the design of the building. But very much that links to the idea of the corpse roads and making it difficult for the ghost to get back home. And also the idea that if you put a funeral on the same path as the wedding, the bride was going to die, or the groom would die, or probably the vicar would die. There would be on another death. And it's interesting in Shropshire as well, you shouldn't leave a grave open. So if you are a grave digger, you should dig the grave pretty much near to when the person's actually being buried. You shouldn't leave it open, because apart from the fact someone will fall down a grave, which my mum has done twice, it can actually encourage another death within the community. And also, if the grave is open when someone is getting married, the bride will die within 7 days. There's a lot linked to death almost being contagious, and I think that links back to the corpse roads, because if you take them up over the hills and you take them on this really confusing route, they're not going to be able to get back to the community, and they're not going to be able to then make more people die.
I think that's so interesting. I think one thing as an aside as well that does make me think when you say like, and I love that you casually mentioned that your mum's fallen into a grave as well. I always think of, I don't watch EastEnders, but I did used to watch EastEnders years ago when Peggy was still in it. And there is a scene where she classically slaps someone and they fall into a grave. And I was like, only Peggy Mitchell.
Yeah.
But I think it's so interesting. So another thing I suppose we can lead on to in terms of talking about death omens and things is, of course, the banshee.
Yeah.
So just for context to explain, so the banshee is warming to the theme of this guardian of the graveyard of the tall, sort of preternaturally tall woman screeching. A banshee is not dissimilar to that, are they? So
No.
they kind of scream and alert somebody to death, and it is the most blood cooling scream, isn't it? It's vile, and we don't have sound effects, but if you can just imagine a horrible, like I say, blood curdling scream. It's predominantly an Irish thing, isn't it? But do you find this is something that comes into Shropshire as well, this woman screaming as a kind of omen of death is forthcoming?
I think whenever there is a pocket of an Irish community, so particularly a lot of Irish miners, there was people that would move
as a sort of diaspora,
or people like itinerant workers, that kind of thing. You see these stories crop up, and also people that maybe have, even as we go into a more modern times, a friend of mine's uncle and father side of the family was Irish, and they believed very much that a banshee would come whenever there was screaming, whenever there was a death impending in the family. But in terms of Shropshire, you don't see much mention of the banshee. What you do see is weird instances of like animal omens coming to tell about impending death. So there's one story where a woman, whenever a robin comes into a house, there is a death in the family, and she mentioned this, again, it's a Victorian kind of belief, she mentioned 3 instances of a robin standing in the threshold or standing in her kitchen, and then someone in her family dying. There's a fascinating example in Peploe Hall of the lord of the manor dying, but before that loads of birds swarming the house and kind of flying into the windows.
That, but
it's very iconic, but also this is being reported in the newspapers. So there's got to be, I know that Victorian press was a little bit less credible, but there's got to have been a belief in these things happening for it to be reported widely, even just outside of Shropshire. But the banshee, I don't think, makes as much of an appearance as, say, some of the more animal ones.
They're more animal led. It's interesting, and I wonder, like we were talking about the owls, and I wonder if the same thing with, because obviously Robin Redbreast, bless them, despite being absolutely adorable to look at, they are pretty fiery, and they will kick the shit out of each other. They won't, like, they're pretty territorial. And I'm wondering if it's the same thing as they're synonymous with winter, and I wonder if the same with owls. We don't generally think of owls as daytime birds, and so I'm wondering if the sight of an owl acting strangely, for which there might be a natural explanation, is something that you don't generally see in the day-to-day, becomes sort of associated with something more sort of sinister, basically. Because there was a ghost story, and I know it seems a bit tenuous, but I got to sweep it in because I mentioned it to you, and I think from chatting it's one that you're already aware of, but I absolutely love it. If you want to talk about 19th century at its kind of peak ghost frenzy, is the Ludlow Castle ghost, which is, there's a long-standing story about a ghost, the White Lady who was betrayed and threw herself from the tower. But at one stage in the 19th century, and I don't know the exact date, there was the sound of sort of squawking, squealing, which a number of people heard. Raised the alarm to the point that people were all gathering, and they were going into the castle, and they were awaiting, and, you know, in the early hours, the small hours, waiting to see what this ghost would catch a glimpse. And eventually it was discovered to be a nest of owls.
And then everyone just kind of collectively agreed to never talk about it again.
They were just like, oh, this is a bit embarrassing, actually. It was kind of cringing. Should we just go? And the owls are like, hello. And I just love that idea that this kind of whipped up frenzy, and everyone's like, oh my God, let's all gather. And it's a bit like that idea, I suppose, everyone gathering at Blickling Hall, isn't it, in Norfolk, waiting for Anne Boleyn. I think the wonderful Tracy Borman, whom we have to give a shout out because she's heaven. So Dr. Tracy Borman, she went one year as well, and they all gathered there waiting for this horse and carriage to come, sort of the ghost stop, to come galloping across the bridge over at Blickling Hall, and of course, inevitably, it never does. But it's fascinating, and I suppose, like we talked in the witchcraft, I talked about witchcraft in the last episode, how some ghost stories, if you want to go into that, because you and I love a ghost story, how some prevail, and whether fictional or not, and you could argue all are fictional if you don't believe in ghosts, but obviously literary ghost stories. But if we're talking about ghost stories from life, in inverted commas, how some prevail and some don't. So Anne Boleyn, for obvious reasons, because it's Anne Boleyn, and she will continually be something of a cultural interest and historical interest to people because, you know, she died young in very traumatic circumstances, things like this. But there are some ghost stories that are so familiar to us, and that, like, you know, was it Scratching Fanny of Cock Lane and all these kind of things. And there's a wonderful, I just had to get that in, didn't I? Obviously. But there's a wonderful one in Bristol, which I did talk about on our socials actually a little while ago, about these men and his daughter were renting this a series of rooms, and they wanted to terminate the lease based on the fact that they thought it was haunted. And they really went along with this, and whether they believed it or not, I don't know, but they tried to provide evidence that it was haunted. I would have thought chances are they probably had a less than salubrious landlord and they wanted to live somewhere else. But they really, in 19th century fashion, went with the fact that this is haunted. And I imagine they probably thought, you know, this is a good way out. Did they believe it? I don't know. But why do you think that some ghost stories prevail and others or you know, what's the recipe for a ghost story that's terrifying, and what's one that delivers a bit of humour?
So I think there's multiple reasons why a story will prevail, but I think it's to do with its meaning. So I believe in ghosts to a certain degree, but as a folklorist, it doesn't matter to me whether they exist or not, because they are incredibly powerful messages. And I think I touched on it briefly when I mentioned trauma. I think the ghost continues because it's something that deserves to be remembered. And that's not to say that all the other versions of ghost stories that have existed and have gone in the past didn't deserve to be remembered, but they are something that we can learn from even now. And I think that it's a good kind of maxim idea that a ghost is never just a ghost. It's never just a haunting. There is something that we can learn from it, and often it can provide us a window to a society that's often very underrepresented or forgotten about. Particularly within the Shropshire context, there were a number of, again, female hauntings that manifest as white ladies or women that maybe are static hauntings that appear and disappear, but their stories are continued and remembered because of something very, very tragic that happened. So to go back to Telford, there's one in Dawley Parish Church, and we know this ghost only as Martha. Now, part of my work, I try and find the historical, like whether these people actually existed.
So you go and research.
So as a standing point. And some of them I've been able to prove, like Martha, and then not Martha, Nanny Morgan and Polly Myers and people like that. They actually were tangible, real people. But Martha is one that I can't find much historical evidence to say that she actually existed. But she lived in the 1900s. Some versions differ, but it seems like more a Victorian story than later. And she was said to have been a young woman, still teenager really, who went to work in a local hall for a lord, and she was very good at her job. She loved her job, and it provided a necessary means of income for her family until she got pregnant. Now, the story doesn't specifically say it was the Lord of the Manor's child.
Probably didn't need to.
But it didn't need to. I think within the kind of culture at the time, it would have been understood, particularly by women. So this woman, and particularly because she chooses to go to her boss, she doesn't go to her family or anyone else. She goes to her boss and she tells him she's pregnant, begs for help, and he casts her away. Clearly he doesn't want to be reminded of his indiscretions, so that's why he's cast her away. At least that's what I think. And she goes to her parents and they do the same, cast her away. So she descends on Dawley Parish Church because that's the only thing she can think of is to turn to religion. So the story says that she sits in the church and she begs to God to give her a sign whether she should continue to be here. And it is quite a difficult story. And she prays, having very dark thoughts. But then around about kind of evening, when the sun is starting to set, the verger comes in and tells her to leave. Now, this man doesn't know the situation. He's got no idea of what's going on. He just sees a young girl who is in his church and he wants to lock up, so he sends her away.
Doesn't think she might be there for a reason.
No, and she takes that as a sign from God that even God's abandoned her. And the story says that she walks outside, she's stolen a razor from her job, she cuts her throat and runs through the churchyard. Now, the verger is absolutely horrified by what happens, and he chases after her and does her best to try and help her, but he's quite elderly, so he can't get her, so he runs to get the vicar, and they find her face down in a nearby pool. And her spirit is said to enact her final moments running from the church into the area where she's no longer a pool, it's completely shut off, but she's been a haunting that's seen fairly recently within our lifetimes, which is 100 years.
I was going to say, which is a good
ancient.
142 years. Yes.
And I think this story has continued, and stories like this have continued, not so much because she was real, but because her story resonated with a whole community of marginalised women. Because
of what their message delivered, exactly,
The familiarity of that young woman being taken advantage of sexually and morally and what have you resonated with a whole group of people. She became the woman that got caught out. She became the woman symbolic of a whole generation of women. And in a similar vein, Mary Way, she was the woman that didn't get away from the men, the predators. She was the woman that had this done to her. And these women then are symbolic culturally because they tell the story of a whole group of people. And when we look at Martha's story happened before and Martha's story happened since. You know, when you look at kind of some of the young mothers' homes in Ireland and things like that, these are women that have been taken advantage of by a man, and that's why these stories continue. I think some continue because they're really bloody good or they're scary or what have you, but I think there is a strong vein, at least in Shropshire, of these things continuing to be told because the community still understands or resonates with it.
There's a moralistic idea to them, and I think this whole thing of, again, of course, because you, as would have been very, very familiar to 19th century listeners, in terms of, you know, suicide, unmarried mothers, things like this, that were sort of on one vein frowned upon, but also on another held a deep level of sympathy by some. But for many, it was a warning of, you know, this is what can happen to you if you don't kind of keep your wits about you, but would be buried in things like the north side of the churchyard. And this idea that this kind of isolation, this loneliness of things that to us is so deeply tragic, but to the Victorians was a kind of moralistic lesson of like, you know, if your morals are not intact, this is what happens. And sometimes mostly, predominantly, it's pinned on the woman really when men are kind of flying around with their, you know, cocks out doing what they want, and kind of women are the ones that are having to slit their throats in churchyards. And I think it's really sad. So whether she existed or not, like you're saying, it's the bigger picture of what that represents, I think is just so deeply tragic. And that's the thing with a lot of ghost stories, and again, it changes. You kind of have this sort of Dickensian-esque idea, or, you know, Henry James, The Turning of the Screw, like the kind of the ghosts of, you know, whether it be a valet, a manservant, whatever, kind of with his lustful ways, or, you know, even in that dynamic that the governess fell to her lusts, and now she's kind of, you know, doe-eyed and committing sins because of this kind of overly kind of aggressive, sexualized figure in Peter Quint. And I just think it's really, really interesting. So that idea of these ghost stories that prevail, like women because of acts of extreme violence, haunting always hedge, you know, kind of country lanes and things like that where they've been violated. And there's that famous one, isn't there? I can never remember the name of the house, but, you know, the Hellfire Club, one of the girls went to the entrance of the cave thinking she was meeting her lover, and these boys threw stones at her and things and taunted her, and then one killed her. And you've got the Red Barn, all these famous murders. The other thing I always find really interesting is ways of tricking spirits and things that were kind of considered malevolent. So you look at like crossroads and how people who'd either were murderers, things like this, they would bury them at crossroads with a stake through them. Kind of pinning there, and almost like in a kind of Bram Stoker-esque way, but so either that they couldn't kind of rise, but also to confuse them. Is there much in the way of Shropshire or evidence like that for people trying to baffle ghosts, bamboozle them?
We are told that crossroads are prevalent. There's a saying in Shropshire that a ghost cannot come where a cross is worn. And that can be taken literally as like a crucifix. So if you have a crucifix on your person or you have a crucifix on your house, the ghost cannot come because there's a crucifix there. Because they are a kind of perversion of everything that's holy by this point. When they've become a spirit, they are less your loved one, and they are a version of someone that should be removed. A ghost is a problem in Shropshire folklore, but also the cross symbolises the crossroads as well. So there are a number of people who are anecdotally, again, historically it's less clear, were buried at crossroads, murderers being some of them, people that had been hanged being another one of them, and also suicides as well. Sadly, people who had taken their own life were anecdotally said to have been buried at crossroads. There was one in Claverley, which was said to be really quite late in the Victorian period. That was the last person to have taken his own life, was buried at the crossroads near there. And we see that again, this fear of the potential of a ghost. The people that are more likely to haunt aren't the people that have had a good life and a good death. They are people that have had their life snatched from them. They are people who maybe haven't had the correct burial rituals given to them, or people that have been either tried and had their life taken in a criminal sense or taken their own life. They are the prime people for kind of hauntings within the Shropshire context. And we see even, interestingly, evidence of ghosts that are said to come that aren't directly linked to the actual area. So there's a chap called Enoch ap Evan, and not to get too much into his story, because it is a little bit of a kind of twisty little path, but Enoch was a Puritan, very devout Puritan, and he was said to have had a argument over religion with his mother and brother, and axed them both to death. And it was a very kind of salacious trial, and it was all over all over the early modern kind of press. There was a book written about it. It's in the public domain, so it's very easy to read. It's a fascinating trial, and he was hung. It was in Clun, so he would have been hung nearer to Clun. Definitely
my
Clun.
neck of the woods.
But in the 1800s, we are told that his ghost haunts Bishop's Moat, which is near Bishop's Castle, which isn't actually too far away, really, but it's a bit of a stretch for a ghost. And the wonderfully named John Thomas is...
See, penises are always relevant.
Me and the dick jokes.
Love it,
The wonderfully...
Me and a dick joke. They're back, but they're not severed. No. No one's listened to the first episode, so they're going to be like, what the hell is severed?
What are they on about?
Yeah, go to the first episode. But sorry, Amy, carry on.
So the wonderfully named John Thomas, who was a man very knowing in country matters, we are told. So he's like our granddads, I think. He says that the boys around Bishop's Castle were terrified of going to Bishop's Moat because Enoch ap Evans' ghost haunted there. So it's interesting because there was a gallows at Bishop's Moat. There was a gallows there, but there were a number of different spirits. They talk about haunting, like ghost pigs and all sorts of weird and wonderful things. But his ghost is specifically mentioned as haunting Bishop's Moat. So the research I've done, it wasn't where he was hanged. It was near a Clun. So it's interesting how these ghost stories can migrate and travel and become associated with a new area. So he would have been tried, put to death, and buried outside of the consecrated ground in one place. But his story has now become attached to another place. Now, that could be through people from Clun moving to Bishop's Castle and telling the story. It could be workers swapping stories and it getting mixed up, or it could be that story resonates with the people from the area. There's a similar kind of situation, but it is, I think, the way in which death is conceptualized in Shropshire through the rituals associated with preventing a haunting, and then even what you do when there is a haunting is really interesting, because there's an awful lot of ghost laying traditions in Shropshire, which involves, there's rather annoyingly, the ritual itself is never actually discussed. We're never actually told how you lay a ghost specifically. There's not a wiki how of how to put a ghost in a bottle. But we know it has a real prevalence in Shropshire folklore, and it tends to be quite aggressive angry spirits that are trapped. And it's a ritual that usually involves a bottle as a vessel of containing it, and various amounts of clergy, between 1 clergy and maybe like 12 is the most I've seen, descending on the churchyard or the area that the haunting is, and doing these rituals that we're never told what they are, praying constantly, and
Freemasons kind of,
and then inevitably that bottle, the ghost is trapped in the bottle. And some versions interestingly say that the ghost is then travelled to the Red Sea and dropped in the Red Sea, which we know just isn't happening.
Like I was going to say that if you're thinking Bishop's Castle Clun's a bit of a trek, I'm not taking these. That's raising the bar.
And my favourite example of ghost bottles and this kind of haunting is from Stanton-upon-the-Heath Hine. And it's from 1779. There was a woman that's called Elizabeth Brown. And Elizabeth Brown was an eccentric in life. She avoided church. She spent a lot of time in nature. Weirdly, she never has the mantle of witch bestowed on her, but she's actually quite a good candidate for it.
She sounds perfect.
Very much could be seen in that vein, but she avoided any organised religion. She kept herself to herself, that kind of thing. And when she died, she requested one request, that she should be buried in the forest where she loved, which is lovely.
I want to be her friend.
Yeah, me too.
Too late, but
only a few centuries. So they do that at first. They do actually honour her request and bury her within the forest. But then they start to see her ghost wandering the fields and the forest, and they think, oh, wait a minute, we've messed up here a bit. So they exhume her body, which happens an awful lot in Shropshire folklore. Is we're more than happy to just dig up a body and steal their teeth, or take their coffin nails or something. But they take her body and they bury it in consecrated ground, and that really, really pisses her off. I'm talking
religious. That's like,
really. And her spirit becomes very aggressive. It haunts the local area. My favourite description is that she sits on a stone, a really big stone in the area, and she insults all of the passers-by. And her insults were meant to be so rude and awful.
Do we have an example?
No, we're never told. That actually the community was absolutely offended by what she was saying, and then they tried to deal with it one way and it doesn't work. So then that annoys her even more, and she takes to scaring the cattle and stomping on grave sites and really defacing the memories of other people. So then we have them call the local reverends and priests and various religious folk in the community, and they do this ritual where they trap her spirit, and it doesn't succeed at first, but then they manage to actually trap her, and the bottle that she's trapped in is then put in the local church, and it's said to have been concealed in the local church. And it's interesting with ghost laying is it's not a permanent fix. It can be, the ghost is said to be trapped for anywhere from maybe 99 years to 1,000 years. But it's never seen as a permanent way to stop the spirit. And I think
intermittent.
And I think that's because they've already made the mistake of not following those rules to stop the spirit in the first place. There's all this kind of idea in folklore that you do A, B, C, D, the person's buried, and then you don't have to worry about the ghost. They've not done that. So there's only a temporary fix for it. And if they'd have just maybe left her buried in the woods, she might not have been causing any issues.
I'm just thinking, if you do believe in such things, if she's been buried in the church, she's pissed off. I mean, she's going to be fucking furious with the bottle scenarios. Like, guys, you are just not. I mean, you're stoking the fire. It's interesting. I suppose a lot of these ghost stories are kind of like, how. Maybe if you think of the Tower of London or something, and you've got heads on pikes and they're like, behave yourself in the capital. A lot of these ghost stories are delivering exactly that message, aren't they? Like, this is what's going to happen if you don't keep your drawers on, or if I mean, to be honest, this is going to happen because men keep shagging servants with or without their consent. But it's interesting, this kind of idea. I mean, one thing that is interesting that I'd like to talk about and see if there's a record of in Shropshire as well is, of course, body snatchers and resurrection men, because Burke and Hare most famously, and they say up the stair with Burke and Hare and all this kind of stuff, but how you see graves with these wonderful ornate cages on and things to protect themselves from having their bodies robbed, which is a very real thing, particularly in places like London, of course, and these graveyards. I think there's a few interesting things about graveyards, and people should go and see them if at all possible. There's a beautiful one at Hope, near where I live. That's a gorgeous example of a I suppose 19th century, we should say, graveyard. You've got the Magnificent Seven in London as well, but there's examples. I don't know if there's that many in Shropshire, but certainly in the cities there's ones of caged over to avoid these men that would take the bodies, and the idea was mostly for medical science, wasn't it? They could take them to the hospitals and things like that. I'm assuming for the most part it probably wasn't a big thing in Shropshire, given that we weren't, our proximity to a lack of medical colleges and schools and things like that. But do you think there was still a fear of your body being taken?
So I think there was more of a fear of what would happen to your spirit afterwards
rather
in Shropshire
than the
physical remains. There was a way that was proper and seen proper to do. But also there's a number of instances in Shropshire where you just deface a grave to take a bit of them and in hope
like a relic.
Then cure a certain thing. So teeth, the amount of teeth that are taken out of the dead bodies after even after the person's been buried, that happens quite a lot. There's a belief that in order to stop rheumatism, you take 3 coffin nails from 3 different coffins. In some parts of Shropshire, it's 3 different churchyards. In other parts, it's the same churchyard. There's the idea that a dead man's hand can cure the king's evil and other types of skin diseases. So in Shropshire, it seems like quite a lot of the time we were chilling in the graveyard just stealing bits of them.
Putting people with rheumatism through quite a lot of work. Like you're achy. Well, I'll get you to 3 different churchyards, get nails from coffins. Like sage advice.
So I don't think there's as much of a fear, probably because we're not as near to medical communities and those established churches, but also it's not as seen as big of a sin, I suppose, to go to the churchyard and take something. As well, there's an idea that if you take half a brick from the churchyard and put it underneath your pillow of a night time, you'll dream of your lover, which is a bit weird. But I think the churchyard was somewhere that there was a lot more time spent as well. So there's certain times of the year where people would go to the churchyard and have like love wakes and different festivals and things like that that were condemned by the actual institution of the church, but collectively it was something that people did. As well as that, on Palm Sunday in Shropshire, in quite a few communities really, people would go to the churchyard and they would decorate the graves with flowers and then sit and have beautiful. It's lovely, and they would have a drink and spend more time, physically time, in the graveyard. So I don't think that, at least in my opinion, there was as much of a taboo about either taking things from the graveyard or spending time there. And I also don't think they were really seen as a whole as something that was a scary place or a negative place. I think because you've already done what you needed to do. You've made them die on the floor, not on a feather pillow. You've changed the room around so they can't get there. You've took them on a route up on the corpse roads. You've then made them cross the lich gate and buried them at the right time and made sure there was not a wedding. So you've done everything mentally to tick it off,
prepare for it, so you feel that fear is not there. It's interesting because, and again, like I say, Hope Churchyard because it's a good example of this, but you get yew trees obviously are synonymous with graveyards for a number of reasons, and even from a practical point of view that they're toxic to cattle. So in medieval times, it would mean that people didn't graze churchyards and things like that. But this idea that they're the trees at the entrance to the underworld, I think it's so interesting. And that hopefully in more recent times, that idea, because especially in places like London, you see people doing yoga and all sorts in churchyards. But I think there's still, whether it's the sort of the Victorians that kind of in literature made them creepy places again. Do you know what I mean? The kind of, if you go there, because I regularly, I do a lot of running around there, and I get to Hope Churchyard, and I wait, for some reason, whatever it may be, I don't run through a churchyard. I always think unless you're being pursued, but I walk through the churchyard, and it's a good chance to catch your breath. But I always find them very tranquil, quite relaxed places. But they do harbour this kind of fear in people, thinking that if you go there, you're immediately going to see a ghost. I think it would be interesting to see if people kind of, if you can, generate, and we've got some brilliant historians that kind of go into great detail about kind of graveyards and things like this, and kind of revisiting this idea of their places of historical interest and to be respected and enjoyed, rather than somewhere that is to be sort of petrified of.
Yeah.
I think they are perfect settings for creepy things. Like, you know, if you're ever going to transition into a kind of a werewolf or something, someone's going to do it in a gothic churchyard in a Hammer horror film.
Yeah,
But
and they're not going to do it in Tesco car, are they?
no, they'll be like Richard III. Are they like, oh, here he is, bless him, bless his heart. What's he doing down there? But you know, let's tell a couple of ghost stories, because you must have a cracking ghost story for us. Go on.
So one of my favourite ones, I've got several favourites, because I spend probably as much time around the ghosts as I do around the living. I'm a teacher, so by day I'm with children all day, and by night I'm reading about ghosts.
Yes,
so my favourite does move. So I've got two that I love. One is quite comical, but it has quite a deeper message, and one is profoundly quite sad, but also holds a message. So we'll start light. We'll start
let's
happy.
do that. Yeah, go on.
And that is the Burley Fighting Monks of East Hope.
Okay.
So East Hope is a beautiful little parish that is just kind of on the tail end of Wenlock Edge.
Okay.
There's a few houses and a church. It's very, very remote. You feel when you're there, you are the furthest way from any civilization. You just feel so remote, but in a really positive way. So originally in the medieval period, this church would have been part of the Wenlock Priory community.
Yeah.
So it would have paid taxes to Wenlock Priory, and it would have in a way been controlled by the priory. And we're said that these two monks were quite bad boys in life, and they had kind of basically gone to the monastery to lay low, not so much as a religious calling, but more as the monastery will have us. We've been bad enough to hide.
Yeah.
But they're actually kind of accepted, and they quickly gain the monks' trust, probably because they're, I don't know, burly.
I love that that's a script. Like,
Yeah,
you know,
and
that's like a
in the
prerequisite.
In the 19th century sources where I originally found the story, they are burly. It's not something that's a later intonation. They're the Burley Fighting Monks.
Why do they? I suppose it's part of the fighting, but it's just interesting, isn't it? It's
They're
like,
being big chaps.
yeah, exactly. They're like, these guys are hot, just by the way. Well, I suppose it depends if you find Burley hot or not. But yeah.
And so they get quite a good job within the monastery, and they're told that actually they can go and collect the taxes. Because these men aren't there for religious reasons, they see an opportunity. So they go from village to village, and they tell the villagers that the taxes are a lot higher. And they cream a bit off the top.
Ooh.
And then they get really, really drunk.
Yeah.
They gamble, and they have a lot of relationships with women whilst they're doing it. And then they move to the next community and do it. And this happens for years. They've got a really good thing going on. But these men don't actually really like each other. They trust each other enough to know that they're not going to spoil it. But they don't really like each other. So they
makes it even worse, doesn't it? You just think, ugh.
And they frequently get a bit too drunk and start arguing, and occasionally it breaks almost into a physical fight, and the community has to split them up.
Yeah.
So they go to East Hope one day, they get the money, they get to drinking and, you know, partying and all of the sins of the flesh, but they've run out of that money quite quickly.
Yeah.
So one of the monks has a shred of decency, and he says, no, we should just go home. Like, we should, you know, say that we go home. But the other monk, he's absolutely unrepentant, and he says, no, actually, we'll just spend all the money and say that robbers took it. What they're going to do. It's the medieval period.
Yeah.
So they argue, and then it breaks into physical violence. But because they're burly, the people in East Hope don't want to split them up, so they let them fight it out. Oof. But
it's quite morbid in a way. It's like, it's quite, if you think about the reality of it, you're like, oh god, that's really quite a creepy image.
So these monks start beating each other to reckless abandon, kicking and biting and punching, but then they fall down a flight of stairs, which is convenient. It's a bit like
it's almost like a cartoon. You're like, and then they fell down the stairs, like sound effects. Yeah.
And that when they fall down the stairs, they both hit their little noggins on the
they're burly, but their heads a little.
Their heads a little.
20 heads.
And
20 heads, shrunken heads. Yeah.
They hit their heads and they both die on impact.
Oh, Christ.
So the community's terrified because we've got two dead monks, even though they were
burly,
Romans.
Small heads. Yeah.
So they bury them in the churchyard, and there is 2 stone slabs in the churchyard that are still there to this day.
Oh my God.
That are said to be the graves of the Burley Fighting Monks.
I love it.
And one of them has a big crack through them, because the ghosts are said to come back every evening as the sun is setting and beat each other to reckless abandon still in the churchyard. And
old habits die hard.
Yeah, and you can hear them, and occasionally there's a visual seeing, and they're meant to have cracked their own tombstones through fighting. Now, what I love about this story is, apart from the fact it is absolutely hilarious, there is a real message that's running in it. So as you move through the medieval period, there becomes more of a criticism of the institution of the church.
Yes,
the idea that they are selling indulgences and they are taking money from innocent, hardworking people.
We'll look at people like Friar Tuck as well, but they become symbols of like mockery or corruption.
Yeah, and therefore this story, despite the fact it is very funny, is actually a really quite articulate criticism of the overindulgences and the selfishness of the institution of the church that in many ways is a precursor to things like the Reformation. And I think in that way, when we start to peel back these ghost stories, we can see a real message behind them. And I think it's the message with the burly fighting monks is don't trust burly men, but also
small heads.
But also that this is a criticism of the behaviour of an institution, and that sometimes those in power, in this case the church, don't deserve the power that's bestowed on them. So I think, other than being hilarious, it's a really interesting social criticism of the church. And if we turn to the next story, it's again as imbued with meaning, but it's a little bit less hilarious. Well, in fact, it's not hilarious at all.
Okay.
So the Iron Bridge in Telford is iconic. It's the first bridge made of iron. It's an icon in itself. Shout out to the Iron Bridge.
Love it. It's gorgeous, beautiful, especially in the evening. It feels quite safe as well. It feels like you can visit there and not get attacked or something. Like, fingers crossed. Anyway,
and the bridge itself is haunted. It's haunted by two little girls are said to skip and play near the.
This is going to be sad.
And it's said to also be haunted by a loving couple that walk to the middle of the bridge dressed in Edwardian clothing and then give each other a little kiss and disappear. So there's some nice hauntings attached to it, but also it's said to really be the centre of the haunting of the ghost barge of the River Severn.
Oh, okay.
So as one can imagine, with a ghost barge, it's quite a sinister at first haunting, and when you're stood on the bridge, you're said to be able to see it the best.
Okay.
And as a little anecdote, my grandfather worked in Coalbrookdale. He worked in the foundry down there, and one evening he was walking back from work back up the bank, which is killer, and he was said to have seen it briefly shimmering into view and disappear, which could be just that he was very tired after a big day at the foundry, but also it shows that this story culturally is at least making its impact.
It's indoctrinated, is it?
Yeah. And so the ghost barge is said to shimmer into view, and you're meant to see it best when you're on the Iron Bridge. And it's said to be piloted, I suppose you don't pilot a boat, but driven by a incredibly tall, there's a lot of inhumanly tall people.
You know, Shropshire is not a county of height.
No.
And they're like, he was preternaturally big.
And it's meant to be a bargeman that stood wearing kind of black cloaks, very much like a Grim Reaper type figure. And you look down and it's there just long enough for you to see that it's got row upon row of corpses on the boat, which is a very chilling haunting. It's a very scary thing to witness, really.
It's a gothic cargo.
It is, isn't it? And it also invokes things like the kind of the cargo of the dead and Greek mythology, all that kind of thing. It's a very
River Styx kind of
well-known trope. But that's not the end of the haunting. It disappears. But then 2 miles down the road there's an area known as Jackfield. It's known as Jackfield because it is Jackfield. I don't know why I said it like that.
I was listening, like hanging off everywhere, and you're like, it's known as Jackfield because it is Jackfield.
And that's where the ghost barge is said to appear.
Yeah.
But instead of being in the river, it's nearer the riverbank. The actual bargeman is said to still be on the barge, but then there is row upon row of corpses on the riverbed. And again, this is purely folkloric and anecdotal kind of stories, but there is a certain kind of, when you do a little bit more digging, an idea that there was actually a plague pit in Jackfield from the plague of the 1660s. So conceivably then this story could actually be a manifestation of the trauma of living through something like the plague.
Yeah.
And that boat continued to sail down the river with its cargo of the dead because even after the plague had left the area and people had recovered, you don't ever deal with living through something like that.
Stays generationally as generational trauma, yeah.
And the plague of the 1660s massively impacted Shropshire. I think around a conservative estimate, around 25% of the population actually was consumed by the plague. And the main means of transporting the dead was on the river, because this was a time before there was really a good road system in the area or anything like that. So the river was kind of the highway of Shropshire into the wider world.
Yeah.
So we have all these threads that, though they might be folkloric and they might be shadowy in terms of historiography and history, actually makes sense. So this haunting becomes a memory of a time of extreme trauma. And I think that's the vein that we've seen in a lot of the ghosts we've mentioned today, is that these stories continue because something was inherently traumatic.
I think that's fascinating. I think it's beautifully put. And I think this idea that how ghosts coexist with things that happen in life, like we were talking about maybe the debauchery of, you know, pre-Reformation, things like this, or as monks. And sometimes it's monks who acts of violence, and other times it's got a slightly comedic edge because of the idea of the corruption of the Catholic Church. And I always think of things like, you know, like the Virgin Mary and Robin Hood pre-Reformation was the Virgin Mary, and then after the Reformation we have Maid Marian, and it's this kind of shift of how things change. And I know that's not ghostly, but it's looking at this folkloric things coexist alongside what's happening in the world. So even if ghosts, whether you believe them or not, you know, most people have encountered a fantastic story about hearing, you know, inexplicable knocks or footsteps from upstairs and all these things. It's fascinating how society maneuvers their way through deep tragedies with this. And I suppose a good one to end on, maybe as we approach Halloween, and they say that kind of veil between us and the others is very, very thin, is probably the story of the Devil's Chair, which having grown up in the shadow of it, and I was running up there yesterday, this idea that Old Scratch, that the devil was on his way. The version I've heard, and I'd like to hear what you think of it, was that he was on his way to flood the Severn to drown the people of Shrewsbury.
Yeah. And
his apron strings broke and the rocks scattered and they landed where the Devil's Chair is. And what is wonderful about that is it's got its own microclimate. It's Stuyvesant's quartzite, I think, is the rock, isn't it? And when it heats up, it does smell a bit brimstony. If you go up there, and I've been running up there quite a few times, the mist really stays strong up there for quite a while. You cannot see an inch in front of you. And even though I know exactly where I'm going, you do get a bit lost. And you can see how people would have historically, on the longest day, the shortest day, all these interesting things, would have gone up there and felt that it was very atmospheric. And indeed, this idea of the witch's Sabbath, I think it's fascinating that we live just in a country as an island race, that we're so fascinated by ghosts. But in Shropshire, it is so tangible. You can see the Devil's Chair from many places in Shropshire, and it sits above us as a sort of continuation, a reminder of something that is spooky and otherworldly and known but not known. How the familiar can be so unknown is fascinating, isn't it?
It's interestingly, it's a similar story with the Wrekin, which is in my neck of the woods. And traditionally and it's a bit of an aside from death, but in devil folklore, the devil it becomes the devil after it's been giants. So the story starts with a giant and then it will become the devil. Okay. But in the Wrekin, it's actually swapped around. So it was the devil. That's quite originally. Rare, isn't it? Yeah. So the devil had an umbrage with Shrewsbury. He hated the people of Shrewsbury. So
they're not faring well, are they?
No. So he was going to basically flood the River Severn and take a big mound of earth to flood the River Severn. But he meets a very, very wily, kind of intelligent cobbler. And the cobbler leads him astray, and there's all this wonderful back and forth between the devil and the cobbler, and eventually he drops the earth and it becomes the Wrekin. But the story we remember is the Wrekin giant, and the story that entered the kind of cultural zeitgeist in Shropshire was the idea of there being a Wrekin giant, but it actually mirrors another iconic, the Stuyvesant in its original format, is the idea that the devil has this umbrage with a particular part of Shropshire or just Shropshire in general. So he's going to take something natural and flood the River Severn or destroy it. But now we remember it as the giant, which is, I just think it's interesting to have that switch.
How it's that way around.
But both the Stuyvestones and the Wrekin, the Devil's Chair and the Wrekin, are very visible landmarks, but they also look out of place. So the
Yes, they do.
yeah,
Against the modern,
when you look at the area around the Wrekin, there's quite a lot of flat land, and the Wrekin, they say a Shropshire mon is never lost if you can see the Wrekin, and it's very prominent. And equally, when you look at the Devil's Chair, it looks out of place. So I think that's how these stories develop, and I think that's certainly probably a conversation for another episode.
Oh, without a doubt, they would have had the same fascination. I always think locally for me in South Shropshire is always the Callow as well, as the kind of the one. And I suppose we could end as we kind of started, which was with Dickens when he says, I think he puts ghosts perfectly when he says that Marley was as dead as a doornail.
Yes.
And I love that. Right, thank you so much. And we will be back with episode 3 soon. So thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.